All right. So you just finished watching Big City Pizza, presumably. Thank you. I hope you liked it. Welcome to the Q&A portion of this virtual screening. I don't have a moderator, so it's maybe less of a Q&A and more of just me answering a bunch of stuff that's been previously asked. I'll just talk a little bit about the movie and kind of try to go over the basic bullet points of what I've noticed people find interesting or that they're curious about. The first of which is a question I get almost every time a group of people watch the film. And that question is, did Big Stinky survive, Boney's cat? The simple answer is yes, Big Stinky survives. I make the joke that if there was ever going to be a Big City 2, that perhaps Big Stinky would now be a skeleton kitty, a little immortal skeleton companion of Boney's, but that would be the very worst case scenario. Big Stinky is alive and well. Another question I get a lot is what program did I use to make this film? The answer to that is Blender. If you haven't heard of Blender, it's an open source free animation software. It's really cool. Highly recommend checking it out if you've never heard of it. Who did the voices? All my friends. All of my friends showed up and came to my apartment at different times, and we recorded the voices. Ultimately, yeah, they all showed up and helped me out, and that was really nice of them. They did it for free, which kept the budget of this movie at as close to $0 as it possibly could for as long as it could. I did, I had to purchase a microphone, and once I completed the movie, I obviously have had to pay for things. You can only go so far with $0, but I did as best as I could for as long as I could. And getting back to the voices, fun fact, Sean Barry, who plays the voice of Boney, great friend of mine, has never done any acting before in his life. I asked him if he would be a voice in my cartoon and didn't really tell him much more than that, and he said yes. And one day I showed up at his apartment with my laptop and my microphone, and we sat down, and I briefly explained to him that he was going to be the lead character in this film, and that it was all POV style, etc. And at this moment in time, I had recorded every single voice of the film. The film was basically complete, and I had a temp voice in as Boney, and I started recording and put the headphones on Sean, and as he watched the film, I recorded a whole lot of his reactions to just watching it, which I talked to him about before we started, that I was going to be trying to capture some of those things. But a lot of what you hear in the movie, or at least a lot of good stuff that did make it into the movie, is ad-lib or just kind of like Sean's real reactions to things. One thing in particular which still makes me laugh is the skeleton blowjob scene when it's about to begin. You hear Boney laughing and kind of yell, "What the fuck is going on?" And that was, that was Sean asking me what the fuck is going on in the way that he does. So I've hung out with Sean enough to know that I thought his voice is so unique, and he's such a interesting character that he would be perfect voice for Boney, but also to have the opportunity to record him as he's watching the film for the first time delivered a lot of magical things that made it onto the screen. Why is everything shaky and wiggly and wobbly is a question that I get all the time. So there's two answers to that. Artistically is the simplest answer, which is I think it looked cool. I liked the way it looked. And that is true. However, part of its discovery comes from a more procedural standpoint, which is first based off of the fact that a whole lot of the backgrounds and inanimate objects in the film are actually still images that are projected onto the 3D geometry inside of Blender. So for instance, all of the first floor buildings are real photos of Athens, Greece. All of the storefronts and all of the weird graffiti that you see, those are all real photos from the streets of Athens. And the graffiti and just kind of unique look of Athens is why I chose to collect those images and use them. But getting back to the point, if you were to look at that 3D geometry with a photo of a storefront building projected onto a cube and the windows are cut out and everything, and you're looking at that and it's not moving at all, it looks extremely lo-fi. It looks weird and uncanny, and although I was going for weird and uncanny in a lot of instances, this particular look is not the aesthetic I was looking for. So projecting real images on geometry it's a tool, or it's a technique that is used in VFX in probably a ton of movies that you've seen and loved. And it's not an uncommon thing to do, but usually the trick is to create a shaky camera or some kind of motion blur, or like you don't really sit very long at all, more than a frame or two without any kind of movement on an object like this. So for a regular movie that's not from the POV perspective, shaky camera or handheld camera look is the go-to. And you might think that shaky handheld camera is the thing that makes the most sense for a POV point of view. However, if you've ever heard of a movie called Hardcore Henry, Hardcore Henry was an action film that was all POV kind of video game style. And I bring this up because Hardcore Henry, there's a lot, probably more POV films, or there are other POV films perhaps to talk about. But the reason I say Hardcore Henry is because it had a major theatrical release. And what happened is they found like 50% of the audience that watched Hardcore Henry got severe motion sickness. And that was attributed to the shaky handheld camera. It's kind of like VR video games also has, a unique situation where a lot of people, depending on how the game works or whatever, get motion sickness. So, putting an audience into the POV perspective and then forcing them around often makes people feel to in my mind, to have as many instances where I could keep the camera still. It was my hope that I could prevent that feeling of motion sickness. And it's also important to note that like the big screen is really the only place that this happens, with the exception of what I was talking about, I guess, if you're watching this in VR goggles maybe. But watching a film like Hardcore Henry or Big City Pizza on a laptop or a television screen or something less immersive is unlikely to make you feel super sick. But, you know, I had planned on doing film festivals and had hoped to get lucky enough to get this movie on some big screens. So I wanted to try my best to not make people sick. So what I've done is create as many instances as possible where the camera is not moving, it's still, and to make everything else shake. And that shaking limits the thing I was describing earlier about the still images being still and looking lifeless and so uncanny. And in kind of experimenting with this, I found something that I really enjoyed the look of anyway. It's very psychedelic. I'm a big fan of psychedelics and kind of the psychedelic aesthetic. So it worked. With the exception of what I was just describing, which is, does it not make people sick? And unfortunately, I found, no, that's not exactly the case. We had several theatrical screenings so far, and at first it appeared as though no one was getting motion sickness, or I hadn't heard any counts of people feeling sick. But then as we continued to screen more and more places, I have started to hear the complaint that, like, you know, some people are like, oh, I feel a little sick, but I got over it. And then there's been a handful of, I could barely make it through this movie. It just made me feel terrible, and I got terrible motion sickness. And it was an experiment that didn't pass the test that I had hoped it would. Whether or not this particular exercise was successful compared to something like Hardcore Henry, I can't exactly answer. You know, if I could take all the people that got sick in Hardcore Henry and make them watch my film and see if that made them sick, or, you know, if there was a way to collect that kind of data, I would, but I can't, and I won't, and I'll never know. But that is the very long answer to a question I get often. What's the deal with the hypersexualized anatomy of all of the female characters in the movie? That is a question I get a lot. It's also one of the biggest criticisms of the film. And what I'll start by saying is I expected that question to get asked, but what I didn't necessarily expect is certain people who I would have assumed would know the answer to that question, not knowing the answer, which ultimately means that I did a poor job in including my answer in the film. So I'll do my best to explain this, but I suppose the first thing I should acknowledge is that in answering this question, I'm not trying to intellectualize a film where a skeleton pizza delivery driver named Boney gets a skeleton blowjob, or, you know, all of the numerous insane things that happen in this movie. I'm not trying to be pretentious in this answer or say that it's not a super crass and crude film or that it's not boy-coded or anything like that, because obviously it is, and it's a silly movie, and it's supposed to be silly. All that being said, the big city is a huge aesthetic to this film, obviously. I live in Los Angeles, and this city that I love so much has been a big inspiration to the film. And the female beauty standard is, in fact, a big aesthetic of this city. There's an uncanniness to, and this isn't a criticism, only an observation that I find to be unique and interesting, is that, for instance, perhaps you'll go to a certain part of town or a certain restaurant or a certain club or cool place, and you have this Stepford Wives type situation where everyone looks the same, or like, you know, there's this very obvious beauty standard that is like a particular type of fashion in the big city. I find that to be interesting, and I thought that that I was showing something like what I'm trying to describe in a way that would be funny, but also be understood. And it seems to not be super understood. So that is what it is. Others have also tipped their hat at things like Cool World or the American cartoon, in which women are also hypersexualized, and asked if it was paying homage to such a thing. And, you know, perhaps in some ways the answer could be yes, because a lot of things like that have been super inspiring to me. Things like Orson Welles' The Trial or After Hours as well, where, you know, there is this kind of male gaze element that adds to the storytelling. And obviously in the instance of this movie, you are literally the male gaze. So I thought that would be funny. I still think it's funny. What I didn't intend for and don't intend to do is be degrading, which, again, I'm not trying to intellectualize such a crass and crude film. However, what I do want to just point towards is that a lot of things in this movie are based off of observation. So, for instance, you know, if you think about the meme of the dog sitting in the chair and everything behind the dog is on fire and the dog is saying everything's fine, that meme is a huge inspiration to this film. Hyper normalization of kind of this chaotic world we live in is, I feel like, a universally experienced thing that we're all dealing with or have been watching unfold. And I'd like to think that a lot of that is shown in this film. Some people have said as much while calling it like a stoic take on such things, which for me is an enormous compliment, because, you know, that is the hopes and dreams, is that it's not like a downer or a bummer, but just kind of this thing that you experience. So I'm trying to even remember what I was talking about, but it's something along the lines of the crassness and the crudeness based on observation. So for instance, like, you know, I've made a behind the scenes video for this film that I'm planning on including in maybe the Blu-ray. Maybe I'll share it on the Discord for this. I'm not exactly sure, but the Cat's Milk video, in the behind the scenes video, I put the Cat's Milk video side by side with a Carl's Jr. burger ad. And it's not the famous Paris Hilton Carl's Jr. ad, which you may or may not be aware of. That's something that I grew up with. I'm 37 years old, so when that ad came out, it was like this huge part of the zeitgeist, which is like Paris Hilton being sexy and eating burgers and doing a car wash and being all covered in suds. I put the Cat's Milk video up next to the sequel to that commercial ad, which was like some other model doing the same thing, and at the end Paris Hilton comes to help her wash the car. But that ad is equally, if not more, suggestive and kind of explicit as the Cat's Milk video is, but it attempts to do so in kind of more of a subliminal way. And the more backwards in time you get, the more subliminal it is versus just outright explicit. And none of this is meant to be a criticism. So like, in putting that video next to the Cat's Milk video, I'm not trying to criticize the Carl's Jr. video. I'm only just explaining that these things are observations, and that a lot of this film is based off of my observations of things that I find to be interesting and sensational and exciting and whatever you want to call it, living in this world. So yeah, that's another really long answer to a relatively simple question. The last question I can think to answer is, if you loved the movie, and I hope you did, where can I see it again? I don't exactly know how to answer that question, but I can say yes, you can see it again. Follow me on Instagram at Blotto Films. Not just simply so that you can see if I post about the movie showing somewhere or being at whatever the next festival or screening or whatever, which I will do, but also because if you DM me and ask and you actually want to see the film again, I will send you a copy, maybe digitally or a screener or whatever, and keep you updated on physical media. I mentioned earlier, I made a behind the scenes video for a possible Blu-ray. Definitely plan and hope to release the film as a Blu-ray on, I don't know, maybe we'll do the self-distribution thing and like put it on Tubi, or don't exactly have a game plan yet. Don't have a distributor, anything like that. But what I absolutely plan on doing is making sure that anyone who wants to see the movie can see the movie. So yeah, give me a shout. Also, if you have questions that I didn't answer in this little video, you can DM me there or on the Discord for the Chattanooga festival. I'm going to try to be on there and keeping an eye on things. So yeah, I appreciate so much that, not only if you actually sat through all 80 minutes of this movie, but if, by some chance you're still listening to me yap about it at the end of this, then that means you maybe really liked it. And I think that's super cool. And I appreciate you so much watching.